Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming out tonight. So just a few announcements before we get started. First of all, congratulations on making it through the elections. I know those of us who are Seattle voters still have a couple more days until we find out full results, but it's pretty nice to be on the other side, isn't it? I also wanted to thank all of our members who spent the last couple months registering voters and organizing candidate forums. This is really what the league does, and so it means a lot to look back on a very successful and very busy election cycle for us. So give yourselves a round of applause, even if you didn't do anything. And then coming up, we have our December action workshop. So the Washington State Legislature will convene in January of 2020, which is a lot closer than it sounds like, I promise. So we still have spots available, and it is on December 7th, right here at the First Baptist Church. So if you're interested in registering or getting more information about that, we have info on our website and at the back table. Those are awesome events. I highly encourage you to attend if you haven't been before. If you have been, I think you can all attest to how awesome and inspiring they really are. We also have a forum here next month on homelessness, which is going to be a really, really special and important forum. So if you're interested in that, I highly encourage you to follow us on Facebook and on our website to make sure that you get all the information about that event. Also, the league is turning 100 in February. I know we look really good for our age. So for all of you party planners, if you're interested in helping us plan our birthday party, you can go ahead and contact me, Alyssa Weed, for those of you who don't know me. You can come grab me after the forum or get my email and we'll talk. Okay, but tonight we're talking about climate change. And it's a really big topic. So we decided to focus on the current status of governmental efforts to adapt to and mitigate climate change in King County and identify possible next steps for policy action. The League has had a long-standing interest in climate change and has taken and supported numerous policy positions. As you hear from our speakers, think about what you can do personally and what we should do collectively to mitigate and adapt to climate change in King County. All right, and we also have a rock star panel tonight, so you are in for so much good info. Okay, so our moderator tonight is Dr. Meade Crosby. She is a senior scientist from the University of Washington Climate Impact Group. She's also the deputy director of the Northwest Climate Adaptation Science Center. Dr. Crosby works closely with natural resource managers to identify climate risks and adaptation responses for species and ecosystems. Her current work includes vulnerability assessment and adaptation planning, large landscape conservation planning for climate resilience, and efforts to build climate adaptation capacity in communities of practice. Dr. Crosby received a bachelor's in science and biology from Cornell University and a PhD in biology from the University of Washington. From King County, we are excited to have Megan Smith, the Director of Climate and Energy Initiatives. Megan leads climate change initiatives across the county and works in partnership with cities, businesses, and community-based organizations to advance clean energy and climate change goals at the community scale. Megan has over 25 years of experience in developing and managing natural resource programs, building cross-sector partnerships, and supporting decision-making by elected officials at the intersection of science and policy. We're only halfway through our speakers, and I'm already very impressed and blown away. From the Port of Seattle, we're joined by Leslie Stanton. Leslie Stanton is the Senior Manager of Environmental Strategy and Sustainability for SeaTac International Airport. She leads a team of sustainability professionals to develop and promote environmental initiatives throughout the airport, including renewable fuels, energy efficiency, waste reduction and recycling, and low-carbon construction materials. Her team also works on green transportation strategies to reduce traffic congestion for passengers traveling to and from the airport. She holds a master's from Harvard University School of Public Health, an MBA from the Bainbridge Graduate Institute, and received her bachelor's in science from Smith College. From the city of Seattle, we're happy to have Edie Gillis. Edie serves as the citywide coordinator for the mayor's climate initiatives in the City of Seattle's Office of Sustainability and Environment, focusing primarily on congestion pricing and transportation electrification. Over her years at the City of Seattle, Edie has held roles in intergovernmental relations and policy coordination on a wide range of issues for both mayor's offices and the city council members. From 2008 to 2011, Gillis served as senior advisor to Washington State's statewide elected commissioner of public lands, Peter Goldmark. Edie has a master's in public administration from the University of Washington Evans School of Public Policy and Government and a bachelor's from Duke University. Okay. And I'm now going to hand it over to Dr. Crosby, who will go over how this conversation is going to go, because I'm the least qualified person to be in front of a microphone now. So thank you, and come on up.
Good evening. Thanks for coming out, and thank you so much for having us. Oh, thank you. Closer to the mic. Okay, I'm gonna have to hold it. The better. So each of us is gonna have about 15 minutes to first tell you some background information on how climate's changing, how we know it's changing, and the changes that we expect to see here in the Northwest over the coming century. Then we're going to hear about 15 minutes each from our panelists about what each of their respective agencies is doing to respond to those changes. And then we'll have another 15 minutes for Q&A. And you should have received some little pencils and index cards. Oh, they will come around, in which you will be able to ask those questions. Okay, so with my time, I'm going to give some basic background on climate change and then talk about some of the changes to come under different scenarios. As far as the basic facts of climate change, and they are indeed facts, over the past century plus since industrialization, as you all know, humans have been emitting pretty dramatic amounts of heat-trapping gases into our atmosphere. From burning of fossil fuels, from land clearing, deforestation, from agriculture and other activities, we've been releasing methane, carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide into our atmosphere at what is now amounts that we haven't seen in over 800,000 years. We know that we haven't had rates or amounts of these gases in our atmosphere that high in 800,000 years because we have an 800,000 year record of ice in Antarctica and in Greenland. So every year when it snows, we get a layer that gets set down. In that layer of snow, there are tiny air bubbles from that year that are then trapped in ice. And so we take huge ice cores out, and we can go layer by layer through the past, and we can look at those tiny bubbles, and they are snapshots of our atmosphere over time. And we are now way beyond any level that we have seen in at least that time, and probably, in fact, in several million years. And the rate at which these gases are increasing is, as far as we know, pretty unprecedented in the history of our planet. So there's a reason that we are concerned about this. These heat-trapping gases have been leading to warming of our planet. So over the past century, we've gotten about 1 degree Celsius warmer than we've been historically. That might not seem like a lot of warming, but it has huge effects on our planet. We've seen tremendous loss of snow and ice around the globe, which is important because that's a water source for so many people, not to mention ecosystems around the world, and it's contributing to sea level rise. In Washington, we've lost 25% of our snowpack on average over the past several decades. And we are experiencing much warmer winters and continued loss of snow, though we still have variability. We still have snowier years, we still have less snowy years, but that average, the trend is that we've lost now 25% of our snow. That loss of snow has been resulting in changes to the stream flows in Washington. So normally, the rains come in the fall. That rain goes into our streams and they start rising, and then that rain turns to snow at high elevation, and the stream levels drop and all the water is trapped in snow, where it hangs out until spring and it melts, and then our stream levels go up, and we get our drinking water over the summer as our nice reservoir of snow slowly melts. But now that we have more of our winter precipitation falling as rain instead of snow, We are seeing streams having their peak flows much earlier in the season because the snow's melting earlier, there's not as much of it, and by the time we get to late July or August, we have now lower stream flows than we've had historically, which is less water available for people to drink, for salmon to use to get upstream to breed, for irrigation for our farms. We are also seeing our streams get warmer, which is another sort of double whammy for salmon because they need cold water. We are seeing changes in our oceans. So our oceans have been doing us a really big favor in the short term. They've been absorbing a lot of the heat that has been trapped in our atmosphere, so the oceans are getting warmer. And they've also been absorbing a lot of the carbon dioxide. So that's saving us from more warming in our atmosphere, but it's leading to acidification of our oceans. The carbon dioxide that's being absorbed is leading to a lower pH. And this is a problem because we have a lot of shell-forming organisms in the ocean that are very important for the marine food web. So little tiny copepods out there that are shell-forming organisms are really important for salmon, for example. So they're getting hit not just in our streams when they come back or when they're breeding, but also out in the ocean, being affected by loss of their primary food sources. And of course, coral reefs and other heat-sensitive organisms and ecosystems in the oceans are also being affected. The oceans are also rising. So that melting of the ice sheets in Antarctica and Greenland is starting to lead to higher sea levels. But even more than that, when water gets warm, it expands. And so a lot of the sea level rise we've seen so far is mostly due to that warming. And in the future, more of it will be due to loss of ice. In Seattle, we've actually already seen 9 inches of sea level rise over the past century, but some of that is due to the fact that land is sort of sinking in Seattle. We have a lot of vertical land movement going on in our region where in Seattle, the land's kind of sinking. Out in Neah Bay, in the far northwest corner of Washington, the land's actually rising faster than sea level rise. But globally, sea levels are rising. We're seeing changes in ecosystems. Species are moving. So one of the primary ways that species adapt to changes in climate is to move, to try to stay in areas that are climatically comfortable for them. And so on average, around the globe, scientists have measured that species distributions have been changing on average, moving towards the poles. They're moving northward in our hemisphere. They're moving upward in elevation. And they're not all moving at the same pace. So some species are moving a little faster than others or in a different direction. And so ecosystems, what we think of as a dug-fir forest, or what we think of as an arid shrub steppe ecosystem, they're changing. We expect to see the emergence of perhaps novel ecosystems as species rearrange themselves to stay in areas that are suitable for them. And we're also seeing effects where species are losing much of their range as climate, they can't keep up with the pace of change. We're seeing health effects. So we're seeing injury and mortality from extreme events like larger and more powerful hurricanes, larger and more frequent and severe wildfires. We're seeing stress from heat events, extreme heat. We're seeing impacts like effects of asthma and respiratory illnesses from wildfire smoke and other pollutants that are exacerbated by heat. And we're seeing changes in diseases. So we're seeing the spread of vectors like mosquitoes and ticks into areas where they weren't previously as it gets warmer. And all of this is coming with enormous economic cost. So each of these climate disruptions carries a heavy cost. The strength of the evidence for these changes is overwhelming, though you may get the impression from the media or elsewhere that there is any debate about this among the scientific community. There is overwhelming consensus. 97%, that's a figure that's typically used from studies. It's actually a conservative number. 97% of all science around this subject agrees that this is what is happening. That it is warming, that this warming is almost entirely attributed to human activity, that it's bad, that the impacts are severe and will be more severe without intervention, and also that there's a lot we can do about it. It's not too late. The science is also very clear that if we take action to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, we can reduce these really catastrophic risks that are out there in the future if we don't take action. And we know that every degree counts. Everything that we do counts. So I was also asked to paint a picture of what King County might look like in the future based on projections. So I'm going to look out first to mid-century, around 2050, when my daughter will be the age that I am now. If we stay on our current emissions pathways, then the average year in 2050 will be hotter than the hottest years of the past. If you want to think what 2050 might look like, you could take a look at what happened in 2015. So in 2015, we had one of the hottest years on record. It was, in fact, the hottest summer on record. I believe the hottest year on record at the time for Washington State. We had only 4% of our historic snowpack. We had a snow drought. Almost all of the precipitation that fell that winter fell as rain. We had the most severe wildfire season in Washington State history. We had salmon die-offs in the Columbia River. We had over 250,000 salmon die in the Columbia River. Our ski season at Stevens Pass was cut in half. And we had $600,000 to $700,000 million of losses in our agricultural sector. We had, I think it was 17 different crops that had significant losses due to the heat that summer and how dry it was. As far as long-term impacts by the end of the century, my daughter will be an old lady. We're looking at the coldest years then being hotter than the hottest years of the past. So we're looking at significant summer water stress. We're looking at most Washington streams being too hot to support salmon. We're looking at loss of 65% of our snowpack by then. We're looking at more severe, larger, and more frequent wildfires, along with the smoke effects and health effects of that smoke and the heat across our state. More extreme events, when we get all that winter precipitation as water, and we're expecting, in fact, wetter winters even than we have now, and all of that falling as rain. We're looking at significant winter flooding, landslide risks. And all of this is not going to be felt evenly by all people. So we know that economically disadvantaged communities are going to be experiencing the most dramatic impacts and are going to have the least resources available to respond to them. We know that our tribal communities and our rural communities, who are very closely tied to the land for their livelihoods and culture, are going to feel this most severely. And in fact, climate change is expected to amplify the inequalities that we already see around the globe, where those of us who are the most responsible in the global north are going to be the least affected by these changes that we're going to see. So the take-homes that I wanted to make sure I got across tonight is that scientists agree it's real, it's bad, it's us, and there is a lot we can do about it. And the sooner we act, the better. We have a limited window of time where we can still keep warming to a manageable level, but even beyond that, every degree counts, every half a degree counts. And so the sooner we can act and the more we can do, the better. And now I'm going to turn it over to our panelists to share 15 minutes each of theirs, and I'm going to sit down for a bit, and then you'll have time for questions after.
Should we just, yeah? Whose heart is racing a little bit? It's not because I'm nervous to be up here. It's actually in response to the presentation that we just had, thinking about what, as policymakers, we are all up against. So my name is Edie Gillis. I work on the intersection of transportation and climate action for the city of Seattle. And so just so you know, I'm going to talk a little bit about all of the things that the city of Seattle is doing to address climate change. But that isn't particularly my area of expertise, so I'll do my best for my colleagues, especially Jessica Finkoven, who runs our Office of Sustainability and the Environment, and it's her daughter's birthday tonight. So she wishes she could be here with you. I think one thing I wanted to start out with was just a big thanks for coming out tonight. I know you guys have all been working hard around the elections. There are huge impacts that maybe we'll talk about later, particularly around 976 and its impact on what we as leaders in government want to see happen around climate in our cities and counties and at the port. But I just want to say thank you for being engaged, focused on improving our democracy and, believing in the truth of science. So I'm going to preface everything I'm going to say tonight on the fact that Seattle, it has been committed to facing the realities of climate change for a long time. And right now, we, for a long time have been a leader among cities for taking the types of actions that need to be taken to address climate change. However, a lot of the easiest things have been done. And for that, we're still being a model. We're still talking to other cities on the regular about the first and easy incremental steps. But now, the changes that we're trying to make are harder. They're harder on individuals, and they're harder to make as a community. And so a little bit about what I'm going to talk about today is here are some of the things that we've done, and those aren't enough. And if those aren't enough, what do we as like a collective team here in the region and in the city of Seattle need to do to support those efforts? So let's get straight to it and say in 2017, when President Trump started to talk about removing the US from the Paris Climate Agreement, the city, both the mayor and the city council, committed to upholding the pollution reduction targets in the agreement. So that, yeah, thank you. We know that we're already seeing the impacts of climate change. Whether it's the wildfire smokes that was choking out our city last summer, or I guess 2 summers ago, to the storms that flood our streets that we're not prepared for, to the effects that we're seeing globally, nationally and globally. In response, we must lead with bold solutions that reduce climate pollution while strengthening our economy and ensuring the benefits of a clean energy economy are shared throughout our city. But as I said before, we must move beyond incremental change and fundamentally reshape our building and transportation systems for a fossil fuel-free future. So I want to say that again, because designing to reduce our climate emissions is different than thinking about how we design a city for a fossil fuel-free future. And again, one is incremental, one is big, hard changes that we're all going to have to make, both legislatively and personally. And sometimes those, I want to couch it also, and sometimes those changes can be amazing. I was just with a delegation in Stockholm talking about congestion pricing and their regime around congestion pricing. And I'll talk about that. But one of the things that a lot of people we talked to just walking around on the street said, it's just so amazing to get around here on my bike, on the bus, on the train. And we need to make that sort of change, and it needs to be amazing for people. I think we spend a lot of time talking about plastic straws and you just have to buy this car or make this change. But the reality is, I think government has the ability to make those changes be awesome. And, maybe that's Pollyannish, but I feel like there's a real opportunity for us to make investments to make people's lives better than they are today with a fossil fuel-free future. So how do we do that? Let me also tell you about how we are doing here in the city of Seattle. Emissions are not declining quickly enough to meet the goals that we've set out. Total greenhouse gas emissions compared to 2008 declined 6%. So again, declining 6%, fossil fuel free future, right? We're not there yet. GHG emissions compared to 2008 declined 6%, while population grew 13%, and per person emissions declined 17%. The decline in per person emissions reflects the effectiveness of both national standards and local initiatives in increasing the efficiency of both how we use buildings and how we move around. But our difficulty highlights the imperative that we fully transition our growing city to zero emissions soon. Road transportation, and I think, King County will also probably be giving their numbers, but the way that we quantify is basically 2/3 of our emissions come from transportation, 1/3 from our buildings and how we use energy. So knowing that, we need to address transportation head on. So Seattle as a leader. So in 2013, Seattle published the Climate Action Plan, which provided a coordinated strategy aimed at reducing greenhouse gas emissions while also supporting other community goals, including building vibrant neighborhoods, fostering economic prosperity, and enhancing race and social justice. The 2013 CAP, Climate Action Plan, included a slate of hundreds of near-term actions, many of which were actually completed quite swiftly. So by 2015, a large majority of those climate actions were completed, which says to me something about how easy some of those were to actually, all it took was a little effort on behalf of the city government to start tackling some of these things. But the CAP also defined some broad longer-term strategies to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050. In response to the Trump administration's withdrawal of support from the Paris Climate Agreement, the City Council adopted Resolution 31757, affirming Seattle's commitment to the goals established in the Paris Agreement. And actually directed the Office of Sustainability and the Environment, where I work, to identify the actions necessary to do our part to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. The remaining actions developed under the leadership of Mayor Durkin and the City Council are designed to move beyond incremental change and fundamentally reshape our building and transportation systems for this fossil fuel-free future. So let me, talking about transportation, remember that's 2/3 of our emissions. Let me talk about some of the things that we've done and some of the things we're thinking about for the future. So transportation overall, the overall approach to reducing greenhouse gas emissions from transportation is to leverage changes in technology and our increasingly dense city to fundamentally change how people move around. In 1994, Seattle's nationally recognized urban village strategy provided the essential foundation of Seattle's climate-friendly transportation policies. So basically saying if we densify in urban areas, in villages, we can develop the transit system to support those dense urban villages, and more people will be able to get around via public transportation. In 2014, voters like you, many in the room, supported Proposition 1 to fund the purchase of increased metro service and additional transit programs for Seattle residents. This voter-approved measure includes a $60 car tab, so it's all, let the questions begin on 976, but also a sales tax that funded things like increased bus service all over Seattle and also free transit for youth. These are all a bit in question now. Then in 2015, there was the Move Seattle levy, again prioritizing projects that move the most people the most quickly. 2016, the passage of the Sound Transit Levy, again, investing in how we move for not only for folks now, but well into the future, planning an expansion of our transit system. And all in all, it's working. What we are doing, shockingly, is working. During this last 7-year period, downtown Seattle has added 45,000 new jobs. It has become more residential, but only 2,255 new drive-alone trips have been added to downtown streets. I know, let that sink in. So only 1 out of every 4 downtown workers is driving to work. The vast majority of folks are using public transit to get to work or biking or walking. Imagine 976 actually had to cut bus service in half for the city of Seattle, which is what folks are fearing right now. Like, these are we cannot survive as a downtown under that situation, especially with all of the motion and the progress that we've made. So overall, I think I already talked about this. So we are succeeding in making it easier for people to use transit, and people are enjoying the fact that their commutes are and that are improving, and also the improvements that the Seattle Department of Transportation are making to move buses quicker are also working. One of the things that on the trip I mentioned to downtown Stockholm, people were like, why would I ever? It's so easy to just get on the bus. And that's the kind of situation that we want to see in the future for us and for our children, is a situation in which the easiest way to get around, the fastest way to get around, is also the most climate-friendly way to get around. And partnerships with King County around their commitment to all electric buses. I mean, it cannot be understated the level of leadership that King County is showing around showing how public transit can be a critical tool to climate action. I'll also add that the city has its own municipal fleet that is used by city employees to do all sorts of work all over the city. And it's not just, it's police officers to people who do building inspections. But Seattle was one of the first cities in the country to buy conventional hybrids and battery electric Nissan Leafs. We've been a leader in new fuels. 5 minutes. Okay. On the building front, Seattle has also been a leader in the building sector, focusing not only on conservation with Seattle City Lights, green, clean electricity, but an overall approach to reduce greenhouse gases by working with building owners to benchmark how much electricity their building uses, and build in efficiency to those systems. So, with 5 minutes to go, I'm going to talk a little bit about those new big actions that the city is taking now to start thinking about that fossil fuel-free future. One thing that Mayor Durkin announced that she is interested in is talking about improving mobility through pricing. So like downtown Stockholm, like New York City, like London, thinking about how road usage charges can be used to both to manage congestion on city streets, but also make sure that buses can move more effectively and that funding is available to expand those bus services. Electric vehicle readiness ordinance. So this is the idea that while not everyone is going to have an electric vehicle, we want to make sure that if we're building buildings, that we are building in the infrastructure for a future in which those vehicles could be charged. So a new ordinance was just passed this year, or last year, this year, to ensure that while you don't need to put in the actual charging infrastructure, the electricity and lines need to be put into the building to be prepared for that infrastructure in the future. We're also looking at ways to electrify Uber and Lyft and the TNCs, looking at ways to expand our green fleet, ensuring that, looking at opportunities to electrify things like garbage trucks here in the city of Seattle. We're also implementing we're calling our greenhouse gas emissions assessment, which is a way of looking at city projects with the climate in mind. So yes, paving this road may be something that seems like a really good idea, but maybe there is a climate risk or a climate impact that we're not thinking about. Maybe that is also true around building this particular building. We want to bring in climate math into the conversation about how city spends its money. So asking that the planners in the city of Seattle take climate into effect when making major financial decisions. I will end on, we also just recently passed an oil heat conversion tax. This is the idea. We've got folks using oil heat to heat their homes. That heat is not taxed in the same way that natural gas and your own Seattle City light bill is taxed. We want to use the tax on that heating oil to fund conversion for low-income residents, making it that much easier for folks to get off of propane heat and move toward electric heat pumps. So, big actions like the idea of pricing our roads, strategic actions where we know there's going to be a lot of bang for our buck, a lot of reduced emissions for a piece of legislation like a home oil heat conversion. We're looking to take those actions and be that kind of leader at the City of Seattle.
All right, good evening. Thank you for having me here today. So I'm Megan. I'm the Director of Climate and Energy Initiatives for King County. I work out of the County Executive's Office. Whenever I come to a meeting like this, I know that you all in this room must care a lot about your environment and climate change, or you wouldn't be here. I always want to start a little bit of why I come to this work and assure you that I care deeply about it as well. I started working at the county more than 25 years ago and kind of took a path through areas that all touch climate change. So I started out working in flood hazard reduction, worked on salmon recovery, habitat restoration, stormwater management, and a lot on growth management as well. And that kind of led me to a place of interest in working on what I see as really the biggest challenge to our generations and generations to come. How do we tackle this climate change issue and really make really fundamental changes in how and where we live, how we deal with transportation, our buildings, and how we prepare for a different future. I also have 2 teen boys, so I am acutely aware every day of what's at stake here. I started doing climate change work actually before my kids were born. Now they're 14. And every day I think about what's the future for them, what's the future for that generation and generations to come. I will say I have an intergenerational connection to the League of Women Voters. My mom was very active in the 70s and went on to be a local elected official and a environmental policy leader in the state. And let's say I did a lot of doorbelling when I was a kid. And the apple did not fall far from tree. And so it's exciting to see you all here today. And thank you for all you do. I read your article about climate change in the newsletter. I was like, I don't even need to do this briefing. You already know about it. That was great. So anyway, thank you for having me here tonight and for you being here tonight. So King County is not new to this fight. This is a long-standing priority for our current county executive, Dow Constantine, and our previous executive, Ron Sims, as well. So this is something we've been working on for a long time. And I think we've had a lot of successes, but we always have to be asking, what has the most impact? How can we move faster? and how can we move from kind of the incremental changes to those system changes that we know we have to make. And also, how can we support our residents and businesses and all the people who live in King County who also have to make those individual changes that will add up to the transformational change that we need. So what I want to do tonight is introduce our Strategic Climate Action Plan for King County, share some of the highlights of some recent progress and also some of the challenges we face, talk a little bit about, I saw in the questions for tonight, how we work collaboratively with other governments like Seattle and the Port of Seattle and the many cities in our county. And then we are doing a 5-year update of our climate plan. How are we going about making our plan stronger, faster, better? And how are we working with the community to shape it? So you've already heard from Dr. Crosby about the impacts that we project for this region. So I won't talk about that much, except to say we have some information over here about climate impacts in King County. I really liked the way you talked about climate impacts in terms of health and economic and environmental impacts. I think historically we talked a lot about environmental impacts and kind of the changes we'll see in temperature, which are all super important, but sometimes we don't bring it back to how does it affect people in their daily lives and how is it relatable to them. And if we want people to take action widely and deeply, gotta care and see how it matters in your lives. So I'm gonna ask a question by show of hands in this room. How many people in this room were directly affected by or had family members affected by the wildfire smoke the past few years? Maybe you felt like you couldn't go outside, couldn't do your normal activities. So many people in this room. How many people, maybe someone in your family, maybe you have been affected by severe weather events? So maybe more extreme rain, snow, flooding. Okay, so some of you, but fewer people in the room. It's something I think when we look across the country, we probably all know someone who has been severely affected by that. We also know that King County, with our 2.2 million people, increasingly, we have a lot of people who were not born here, who are coming from other places, caring deeply about their families who are in other places affected by climate impacts. So one thing we've really been trying to do is when we have information about climate change in the county, we have infographics that's really visual, we feel really good about that. But then we started thinking about, well, how do people relate to that? So one project we've undertaken is trying to take our information on climate change and both translate it into other languages, but also make it relevant to communities of people who are going to be most impacted by climate change or maybe are new to this area. So I put some of those samples out on the table of how we've worked with community groups to translate and really make that information more relatable to different communities. Okay, so just as the impacts of climate change, they grew out of thousands of individual decisions over, many decades about how we built our cities, how we built our highways, how we continue to get around today, what industries we had over time. Our solutions have to be those many changes, and they have to be absolutely comprehensive. So we really need to be looking at where and how do we build? How do we travel to work, to school, to recreation? How do we protect and restore habitat? How do we heat our homes and businesses? What's all the stuff that we consume? How do we recycle it? How do we dispose of it? And what impact do all those things have? And I think oftentimes we'll hear things framed in a kind of a fear way, like, well, you're not going to be able to drive your car anymore. You're not going to be able to have straws anymore. You can't have these things. You cannot eat meat. A lot of no. And I try to think about it as a fundamental question about how do you create healthy and resilient communities as our population grows. Even if there were no climate change, we know we continue to have population growth here. You look at how much King County and Seattle and our 39 cities here have changed, even in the last decade. How do we shape the community that we want to live in? And I've got another show of hands, because late in the evening, I want to keep people engaged. So how many people took the bus in the last week? Road transit. Okay. How many people went to a park or maybe walked along a regional trail? Yay. How many people bought food at a farmer's market? Okay, a lot of people here. So to me, those are all climate solutions. Those are all about building a community that we want to live in the future. So when you think about it in positive terms, Edie was talking about, like, you want it to be the easy choice to take transit. To have it be like, wow, I can go downtown and I can see the symphony. I can get around easily. That's a good thing. We want to have a world-class regional trail system. King County Metro Transit, we're trying to double transit ridership by 2040. We want to electrify our bus fleet by no later than 2040. That sounds like a long way off. It's not when buses last for 15 years and we have to build out new bus spaces for those electric buses. But those are all things that will make our community better. So I like to think about our climate challenge in front of us. It's very easy to get kind of worn down and depressed when you think about the impacts that are unfolding, and I do. But I think it's also really important to be thinking about what's that future that we want to build together. So when we think about climate actions, kind of the first step in that is really understanding where your emissions come from. So Edie was talking a little bit about that. You know, big sources, when you look in King County at the emissions that originate here, transportation and buildings, kind of two big areas. But the thing we like to add to that is that you can also look at it through a lens, they call it consumption-based emissions. So you start thinking about if I buy electronics or clothing or food that maybe was grown in another country or another state and brought here and consumed here, maybe some of it gets wasted, some of it gets composted, that whole chain moving all the way through, really thinking about emissions in those terms as well. And when we look at it that way, you have food being about 13% of emissions. So food, you know, that we consume and maybe some gets wasted and some gets composted. Goods, about a quarter of emission. So the stuff that we buy and use and have to recycle and dispose of. So when you think about the individual actions we take, those also become really important. So our King County Climate Action Plan, we call it our blueprint. It has two sections. So there's one about how do we reduce emissions to make sure we know that some climate impacts are here now, will continue to get worse, but how do we head off the worst risks? We got to take action to reduce emissions. And then the other half of the plan is how do we prepare for impacts as well. And then I always say we work at two scales. So we look at, for King County government, we run the bus system, we do regional wastewater treatment, public health, emergency management, we're operating buildings and facilities and industrial processes. So we have a lot of things we're doing to reduce emissions from our operations. But even if we do everything right, even if like our fleets that we use in county government are 100% electric, we're less than 2% of the emissions countywide. So you think about that, 2.2 million people in King County, 39 cities, the port, all of us here, King County government is less than 2%. So we feel it's really important, kind of thinking about theory of change in our climate plan, we've got to be community scale as well. And I know that was one of the questions you asked us to think about tonight is how do we work with others to make our climate actions impactful? So King County, since 2011, we've had a King County Cities Climate Collaboration. It's called K4C. It's now 16 cities in King County, representing about 80% of the population. Plus the Port of Seattle has joined us as well, which is great. It was cities for so many years, the Port's like, can we join? We're like, yes. We have a shared emissions reduction goal of getting to an 80% reduction in emissions by 2050. We've also mapped out kind of what does it take to get there? So if you have a chance, you'll see over there, there's a display board over there that looks like a fan of colors. And it's basically getting at what are the steps we need to take? What are the pathways we need to pursue to get to that 80% emissions reduction by 2050? And there are categories like building energy, electricity supplies, transportation, doing things like reducing the trips people take in their cars, the fuels we use in our cars. So from each of those categories, we've mapped out with these 16 partners and the port, like what are the priority actions to get there that we have to take together? So there are a lot of things we have to do as individual local governments, but what is it that we need to do together? And that's been a really powerful thing to have those commitments. And I wanted to give you an example of why. When we looked at our emissions at the county scale, we know we have really clean electricity supplies in the city of Seattle and Seattle City Light, which is great. Puget Sound Energy Territory, a little more than 30% of that electricity is coming from coal. So it's coal-fired plants in Montana, make that electricity, send it by wire into our area. And so we said, we cannot hit our climate goals unless we know we get that cleaner electricity supply. So we got together with the cities and we said, we want to set a goal to be off of coal by 2025. Did you want to say? Oh, okay. Off of coal by 2025 and get to 90% renewable electricity supplies by 2030. That really became one of our top priorities for working together. So we got a consultant, we mapped out what would it take to get there. We worked with Puget Sound Energy. We went as a group of cities in the county. We said, we want a renewable electricity option. We want to be able to buy that. We buy a lot of electricity. King County spends about $10 million a year. We're big customers. We want that. They did create a new renewable electricity option. And 8 of our city partners, and I think the port, Sound Transit also bought on. Universities, Target, REI, several other businesses all bought into that. So that starts to become kind of transformational and impactful. Next step was going to the legislature with our city partners and advocating for the 100% clean electricity bill that passed last session. So it's actions like that where we can come together and say, let's focus on the things that are most impactful. Let's use all the influence and the tools we have at our disposal and let's go make it happen. A set of actions, I'd say, which is, it doesn't get the headlines, but is really important. We know that a lot of emissions come from the building sector. So a lot of that is about the state, Building Code Council, and local governments adopting stronger building codes. So that when you buy a house or build a house or rent a house, you want to have the codes just require higher energy efficiency, things like readiness for electric vehicle charging, making it easy to access solar. You want those things just built into the code. Again, that's at a system scale. It's really impactful. It's really nitty gritty, not very, it's not going to get the headline, but it's super important to do. So that's the other thing we try to do together with city partners so we can be more influential. Let's see. The other thing I would just say, so we had our 2015 climate plan. We are now in our 5-year update. We'll be transmitting an updated plan to our council in June of 2020. The things we're doing to make it stronger, better, are updating all our science and understanding, impacts in King County and what are the actions we need to take to make sure that our infrastructure, our services, our residents are resilient to those impacts. We are weaving considerations of equity throughout our plan. So really looking at who's most impacted by climate change. And then if we're coming up with a solution like we want more efficient buildings, we got to make sure that we are not putting a cost burden on people who are very low income and living in those buildings. It should work out that they get lower utility bills. We need to design programs so they keep those customers in mind. So equity throughout. And then we're adding a whole new section of the plan called Sustainable and Resilient Communities. So I was starting this off at the beginning. We need the impacts and the actions we take to be things that are relatable for people and that they care about. We wanted to have a core of this plan be the people of these communities and how they're, affected, and the actions we take really be framed around having sustainable and resilient communities. So that's another big change of this plan. So I hope you'll check it out. I have postcards on the table that get you to our main webpage. We just wrapped up 3 big public workshops, but we are continuing to offer to go out to different groups and speak or meet with people who want to, let's say, dig into a particular topic like building energy efficiencies. We're happy to come meet with smaller groups, and we hope you'll weigh in on our plan. So thank you for having me tonight.
Thank you, Megan and Edie. That was terrific. I don't know if I'm going to be as exciting. It is interesting. The port's not nearly so fun. I'm Leslie Stanton. I'm the Sustainability Manager for SeaTech Airport. And is it loud, really loud, or just closer? Really loud. Okay. Just remind me when I get a little quiet. The SeaTac Airport is run by the Port of Seattle. The Port of Seattle also, as you know, runs the Maritime Division down at the waterfront. I'm going to talk mostly about the airport this evening. And just try to hit on a couple of themes, and I'll try to make it less than 15 minutes so we can get on with that discussion and get to your questions. Essentially, the Port of Seattle is run by a 5-member board of elected commissioners that is elected by you all, the voters. And as that 5-member elected commission, they reflect your values. And our commission deeply believes in sustainability, and it's why I have my job and my team has their jobs, and we're able to do a lot of the work that we do at the airport and down at the seaport. I can't even tell you how many times during the week commissioners call either me or my staff directly something new that they want. They want to know why we haven't done things faster, quicker, and made more change. So thanks again to the voters to make this happen. This is why I think we see so much leadership in government, and we don't see it as much in private industry, because we have a very vibrant and environmentally oriented community that really believes in moving, certainly believes in climate change. It's really odd that people still say that, but also are seeing the effects of it. So just to get to more specifics here, as folks anyone who's been to the airport lately has realized, it is growing leaps and bounds. We are getting about 50 million people through the airport every year right now, 50 million passengers per year, which is tremendous. We've had double-digit growth in the last several years. So it was really built to hold about 10 million passengers a year. So we've really exceeded what we can actually process. We are doing some building. We're doing trying to build to the north, but the truth of the matter is we only have the property that we currently operate on. It's surrounded by communities. The airport, SeaTac Airport, is not going to go outside the 3-runway system. It's going to be what it is. And as you've probably been reading in the news, there's going to have to be another airport if we're going to sustain this level of growth. So that having been said, the commission is, as I said, very focused on climate protection as one of their #1 priorities. So we have some very rigorous Century Agenda goals, we refer to them, and similar to King County and the city, we are required to reduce our port-owned and operated emissions 50% by 2030. In addition, the emissions that come from the planes coming to and from the airport and the people driving in their cars coming to and from the passengers driving in their cars, we are also being asked to reduce those emissions by another 50% by 2030 and 80% by 2050. I can see you laughing in the background. Yeah, really. And it is funny in the sense that the port and the airport doesn't own any planes. We don't buy fuel. We don't control any of that. We don't control your cars when you come to and from the airport. So it makes a rather stressful strategy plan for my team. Okay, but don't lose hope. Let me just start with the port-owned and operated emissions we call Scope 1, Scope 2. So that is how we heat the build, that's how we heat and cool the airport terminal, and it's how we fuel our vehicles that the port owns. So essentially, the most of our Scope 1, Scope 2 emissions come from heating the terminal. The terminal is heated by natural gas. It heats up and pushes hot air through the terminal. That is obviously a fossil fuel. It's about 70% of our Scope 1, 2 emissions, and then the fleets, the vehicles that you see driving around, those are another 20% or so. The remaining 10 to 15% comes from a small amount of coal from Puget Sound Energy from our electricity. Most of our electricity at the airport comes directly from Bonneville Power, so 99% of it is from hydro. So very low carbon, and so we're very clean. However, we've got these boilers and we have to heat this terminal. So rather than convert those boilers to electric, which is, I think, a powerful strategy and the right one for the city and the county, we've opted to put renewable natural gas in our boilers. And we've been working on this for 7 years. You don't just go out and buy renewable natural gas. Renewable natural gas comes from landfills, wastewater treatment plants, dairy farms where cows poop and the methane comes off the manure, and you can collect it, put it in your boilers if you're really clever. So we've been trying to be clever for 7 years, and we're about to be really clever because we're about to sign this contract and to purchase this fuel and put it in our boilers. And essentially what will happen is we will be able to swap that gas out, and we will reduce 50% of our emissions, which is our 2030 goal, but we'll probably get to it in 2020, 2021. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, thank you. Yeah, it's pretty cool. That's a lot of lawyers involved in that. But what I will say, it was an incredible adventure for me and my team. We're very focused on innovation because you have to be in this business. And so we had a lot of failures. And I say to my team, and I say it to my son, who's 14 as well, that, you're not going to have success. You have to really get used to failure, and you have to embrace failure, and you have to learn from failure. And it's just part of how we go through our lives. And it's especially true, I think, for this issue. We failed many times for different sources of that natural gas that we're trying to get. And I think it's also reflects very well on the port and our leadership that they let us have those failures. It's just part of how we're going to get through this if we're going to. So, and the second part I wanted to talk about was what are we doing for the planes? Because you can talk about our emissions. That's just to give you a sense of the scale. Here, the terminal's around 20,000 metric tons a year, give or take. The planes are 400,000 metric tons a year, right? Big. The people coming to and from the airport, around 250,000 metric tons. So big, still got that renewable natural gas. So what do we do for those pieces of it? And just to kind of cut to the chase here, because I know we want to get to questions. Essentially, since we don't own any aviation fuel, we don't buy it, we just store it, and then the airplanes come and fuel at the airport. We have put together a coalition of airlines to work on bringing sustainable aviation fuel to the airport. The problem is there's hardly any of it made. There's only one place on the globe that actually makes it right now, maybe two if you count the few producers that do it kind of one-off. But there's an incredible demand for it, I think, if you could bring the price down. So a lot of what my team talks about is how do we send price signals out there such that you have producers or people who want to produce renewable fuels but need to get that demand and get that demand recognized so that a bank will loan them money to open that facility. Very hard to do. So one of our number one priorities is to work with the Washington State Legislature and partners at the city and the county to push through what we call a clean fuel standard, or a low carbon fuel standard is another name for it. And it would require fuel producers to have a certain percentage of their fuel be low carbon. If they have to have it, they have to get the credits for it, they have to buy it, has to be on the market. That provides that market signal that says you're going to have a buyer because we have to have it and we have to sell it. So that's one of our number one priorities that we'll be partnering with. I know the city and the county are going to be there. Yeah. And I will say, just on that note, what's interesting to me is 5 years ago, the Washington State Petroleum Association was saying, still, climate change is a myth, and we don't know what's going to happen, and it's so uncertain. How can we do anything? I'm not hearing that from them now. I hear them say, oh, yeah, this is all real. We believe that. But, that low carbon fuel standard, it's not the right policy. It's just, you're like, okay. So I think that's going to be the new dialogue that we have when we go down. And I know that Megan and Ida are with me when we go down to the legislature. This is really tough, very, very challenging. And the League of Women Voters is always there as well. You have to know what the other side says, and you have to think about how do you frame your response and how do we still maintain that support for these important bills. And so that'll be a challenge. And I think that I-976, that's going to change the landscape a lot. So one more thing, and then I'll sit down, just to talk about the people who drive to and from the airport. How do we reduce those emissions? Well, just to let you know, we have really stringent environmental requirements for the taxis. We've had that in place for 10 years. We have very stringent regulations for the TNCs, which is Uber and Lyft, that come to the airport. And we are the first airport in the US to do that. And that, again, was saying we want the taxis and the TNCs to be on a level playing field. So we took the requirements we had for the taxis and required it of the TNCs. So when you come to get you take a Uber or Lyft home from the airport, you'll see a bunch of Priuses all lining up, and that's part of that carbon reduction effort that we make. However, getting other folks out of their cars to come to the airport requires buses, it requires really good transit. Link Light Rail, it takes 45 minutes, over an hour sometimes, to get even from the city down to the airport. It's long. So for many people and for the employees in particular at the airport, they don't take Link Light Rail because they have to get to work and they're only paid $18 an hour. So they may have 2, sometimes 3 jobs. So what are we doing? Again, it gets back to this importance issue around partnerships. We are forming what's called a Transportation Management Association at the airport. All of the tenants, which is the airlines and the concessionaires, the Starbucks, the restaurants, the baggage companies, will hopefully join this Transportation Network or Management Association, and we'll use that to go lobby Sound Transit, lobby Metro. How can we get bus service and express bus service in particular restored and going to and from the airport? And we're also going to toll the airport drive. So I just want to hit those big things, and then we can open up for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry.
Told the airport drive.
Thank you, everybody. I was thinking as everyone was speaking that I don't know if I made it entirely clear, and that's a big flub on my part, but that all those scenarios I was talking about in the future of 2050 and 2080, those are business as usual scenarios. And I think what's really in this, if we do nothing, if we stay on the path we're on. And what is so inspiring hearing all of you is this is not business as usual. So that was really awesome to hear just the level of leadership at all these levels of government. So thank you all so much. So I have a bunch of questions from the audience, and I had some of my own too. Maybe I'll ask you one of my own while I sift through these questions that I've received. And then I realized as I wrote them, I didn't have any real lowballs here. I kind of, or maybe they are because I was asking what I'm genuinely interested in. So
What I want to do is ask my own questions.
I know. So one thing I'm interested in is how you all are working to avoid maladaptation. And so for the audience, maladaptation is where an action is taken to adapt to climate change. So say I have a house on the water, or I'm a city, and I build a seawall to deal with sea level rise. That could be adaptive for my house or for my port, but it's maladaptive in this case for our nearshore or coastal ecosystems that now don't have that opportunity to naturally migrate inland and adapt to climate change. And so I'm wondering about how you all are working across sectors and across your agencies to ensure that actions taken by one do not wind up inadvertently having a harmful effect on another.
I think you're looking at me.
I think we all have examples. The example I go to is, for a long time, I think there was a lot of focus on just buy an electric car. And I actually had a conversation with a member as we started this day, and even governments kind of planning for, our solution in the transportation space is to get off fossil fuel and incentivize clean cars. Like, what do we need? What rebates do we need to get for people? What do we need? How do we make electric cars cheaper? And that's just going to solve. So we don't actually have to change the way our cities grow. We don't have to rethink what communities and what living space looks like. We can just make this transition. I think one of the ways that Seattle is looking at it is, how do we make it just? What is a just transition? So one of the things I said was, how do we make it more amazing to have to use? How do we make it more amazing to use transit to get around? And how does that brighten and engage community members' connections to one another? But also, how do we design policies so that frontline communities who have been bearing the brunt of environmental harms for decades aren't feeling the cost of having to make the transfer the most? And we faced that around our oil heating tax, right? There were a lot of ways that policy could have been designed. But what we ultimately said was, We want the money from this tax to go to make sure that low-income homeowners in the city of Seattle could afford to get their home off oil first, fastest, and free. Because we don't want folks feeling additional harm associated with our climate action.
So I can think of a couple examples. One, I was talking about we really have to fundamentally change where and how we build and how we get to work in other places. And so if you have just that in mind, you could think about, like, we have a goal in our climate action plan. We want to focus 97% of new growth in urban centers, and we want to serve that growth with high capacity transit. That's great. So then you're looking at actions where you upzone areas around light rail stations or on bus rapid transit corridors. Also great. Those are all things we want to do. But if we don't also think at the same time about affordable housing and what the requirements are to provide affordable housing in those communities, and think about who gets displaced and what those changes will do to housing prices, that's a maladaptation, or just an action where we didn't think about all the potential impacts of that. So for King County, we have a climate leadership team. It's kind of our climate cabinet. So we have the directors of multiple departments. So when we're thinking about, hey, maybe we should push really hard for this new energy efficiency requirement, or we want to get buildings off of gas and onto electricity, from an emission standpoint, we have people that are saying, yeah, we should definitely do that, and we got to go fast, and we got to do it this way. But then we also need to have the representative of our housing program in the room to say, have you thought about this, and how are we going to deal about this impact? And also, to think from an equity standpoint, who pays for that, whose burden, and how do we make sure that we deal with that impact? So really important to pursue the action, but ask tough questions so we design it in a way that we don't have unintended consequences.
That was a tough question, I have to say. There are a lot of these trade-offs that we have to make when we design these strategies, and my team, we've gotten to the point where we have these matrices that we present to commission, because there are always tough trade-offs like that. Do you want to pay more for this? You've promised you'd reduce budgets. You've made these promises publicly. How do you do that? So sometimes it can work out. I'm trying to think of a really I guess I'll just go back to saying there are many people who work at the airport that only make $18 an hour. And a number of them are not from this country. They may have 2 or 3 jobs at the airport. They may be on shift work, those kinds of things. And so part of, as I said, the Transportation Management Association is to help them and also to create opportunities to carpool. I will say one of the things we've been trying to do is get a handle on the parking situation. In terms of just social equity and thinking about how do we work that into these kinds of decisions, we do have a parking lot for airport employees that the airlines have mostly been paying for their higher paid employees, like the pilots and the folks that run the planes. They've tried to make a run at completely operating and owning that parking lot. Because we were worried about the people that can't afford to have those parking spots and still don't have bus access yet, we had to say, okay, then the sustainability position, the principled position, is to say, no, if you want to have that parking lot, you've got to reserve a bunch of spaces for folks that are either at these lower pay scales at the airport, and also you have to join the Transportation Management Association, and you have to subsidize busing and Orca cards and other ways, and carpooling to get to the airport. I'll just say that was a way we could come up with showing the trade-off and showing the more reasoned response.
Thank you. There was some mention of this in each of your presentations, but could you tell us more about how the city, county, and port, and other governments, if you like, are coordinating your efforts on mitigation and adaptation?
So I mentioned the King County Cities Climate Collaboration. So again, it's 16 cities plus King County and the Port of Seattle are the formal members. We actually just had a meeting a few weeks ago We were updating our shared commitments, but also our shared state legislative interests. So we've all mentioned clean fuel standard. Getting a clean fuel standard is really important. It needs to happen at a statewide, preferably scale or regional scale to be impactful. So that's an example of the kind of thing where it's like if we're going to hit our climate goals and make really systematic change, we need a change in state policy. So we will often work together and go down and testify together. And in some cases, like on the 100% clean electricity bill last year, we had a group of city officials, and I know the port was down there as well, especially on the clean fuel standard. We just kept going and testifying and having a panel of local elected officials who can be there and say, our constituents are asking for this. We want this. It's essential to meeting our goals, was really powerful.
I just say, I feel like in the climate space, cities are looking to other cities. So, and that is true for county governments as well. But, we work not only regionally with other cities, but nationally with cities that are trying to, hold close to our commitments to climate action. While we've had a administration, turning their back on climate science, cities are looking to lead. And I think that, it's not only our partnerships here, though those are amazing, and it's often, the case that an innovation will blossom in a city, and then other cities in the region will say, hey, how'd you get there? Like, give us your roadmap. And so we can, hand over the roadmap or receive the roadmap and talk to our electeds to make that change happen. And then that same level of action is happening in partnerships that we have with cities, both nationally and globally, who are committed to climate action.
The other coalition we have is more focused on preparing for climate impacts. And so we have a group called the Puget Sound Climate Preparedness Collaborative, and it's actually 4 counties. So that's King, Pierce, Snohomish, and Kitsap counties, plus tribes. And so it's right now co-led by King County and the Tulalip tribe. And that came together in recognition of, we really needed to get our arms around the latest climate science. Not every government, county, city, or tribal government is large enough and has the funding to have a specialist on staff. King County is really fortunate that we stole away one of your long-term employees.
Yes, you did.
From the UW Climate Impacts Group, who helps us greatly, and she is the staff co-lead for this effort. And so instead of having everybody go out and find the latest climate science and try to interpret it for their county, or wrestle with how do we take what we know about sea level rise and fold that into our comprehensive plan and development regulations, we look at those things together. How are you doing with wildfires? What are you doing with land use codes? That's another table where we come together and really try to share best practices and do it across the region.
So I'll just be more broad here about partnerships. We certainly partner with, I know lots of folks. I've been in government my whole career. I know a lot of different folks. But what's, I think, different about the work that we're doing at the airport is we have to reach across and work with the airlines, and we have to work with the concessionaires. And their perspective is very different from a public servant's perspective. And it's one that we just have to continue to sit down and try to understand the way, how do they process information, what is most important to them, and try to find that sweet spot where we get what we want, but we also have to get them something that they want. And I'll just say, with the low carbon fuel standard and sustainable aviation fuel, we knew we weren't going to be able to get those carbon reductions from the airlines because the fuel is simply not currently available. What do we do in the meantime? And we've had a phenomenal partnership with our airlines to look across the airport and say, how can we reduce emissions? And it's actually getting them to idle less at the gates, to get them to turn off their engines, to have them convert their baggage equipment to electric, to helping us bring options to bring passengers to and from the airport in an environmentally friendly way. So subsidizing ORCA cards, not just for their employees, but providing free rides on transit if you purchase an airline ticket. Those, how can you get, take an option on an Uber or a Lyft using the green option where you might carpool with someone. So partnerships can become, actually they're very important, and ways to get people that you wouldn't normally partner with to find that common ground.
So we have just a few minutes left. There are questions about 976. I don't know if we want to end on that note or if you even have any answers right now, since we're all kind of reeling from that. More upbeat, or you want to tackle it? Anybody?
I can tell. Yeah, sure. We what is it? Oh, there you go. How's that? Does that sound good? Yeah, we've been talking about that and watching that come into play because for folks that have been watching that, it essentially by gutting the car tab fees, you've also gutted your transportation budget by, what is it, 40 billion? Do you know the numbers? It was a lot. So that makes our work as climate specialists incredibly challenging. The good news is that by doing that car tab bill may have provided more strength to the governor to actually implement a low carbon fuel standard for lots of legal reasons that I won't go into. So it does actually have a bit of a silver lining to it. And yeah, it's true. So that's one possibility. And I will say, like I said, failure just is part of how we go through this work. So if it doesn't happen in the 2020 legislative session to get what we need because people are so focused on that transportation budget and it's in chaos, we'll do it in 2021.
And I think, you all are news reading folks, but both of our bosses stood up today and plan to go to court and fight this. You all have voted to fund transportation improvements like Sound Transit, like the Seattle Transportation Benefit District. These are investments that you have approved and improvements that we have seen on the ground in our communities that we don't want to see go away. And the mayor and the executive plan on fighting.
No? Well, we have just now 2 minutes left, so maybe I'll just ask one last thing, which is, I feel like, especially with our current federal administration, focusing at the idea that not much is getting done on climate. And I always find it really hopeful that, at my group, we work with decision makers every day at all levels of government and with NGOs and other municipalities, and so much is getting done. It's the happy secret that people are actually doing a ton around adaptation, especially around the state and mitigation. Do you all work closely? How can we make sure those stories are getting out, that folks know that so much is getting done? Do you, within your teams, have strategies for outreach and education and communication to make sure that those are being shared? Because I think people need to hear those right now.
I think we always need to be doing a better job at it. So beyond, when we are doing something like making a major purchase of battery buses or setting up our first charger or putting out pilot test buses, we'll look for media attention on something like that. But I think we have to do a better job of getting the word out about good things that are happening. So, there are things like, fun fact about King County, we produce more renewable energy equivalent to what we use in our buildings and facilities. And we do that through solar energy generation and gas capture at our landfill and our wastewater treatment plants. So I think most people don't know that. It's not something we really talk about, but it's pretty exciting. So I think we need to do a better job really showing how local governments, we have a lot of impact and influence. And we have to do a better job showing that. And I think in working with all of you to support those actions that sometimes are really politically difficult. You're talking about potentially, like pricing of the roads that we're on, or a clean fuel standard that the opponents will argue it's going to raise prices, or tougher building energy efficiency standards. We really need to kind of come together and understand why those things are important and then share the successes.
And with that, thank you all so much for having us. And thank you to all the panelists.
So who'd you end up buying your renewable